Did you know that Albanians didn't have an official alphabet until 1908? Yet, we've been writing in our language long before that. I'll explain how that works in a second, but first let's learn a bit about my language and why alphabets can teach us a lot. In this video, I will talk about borrowed alphabets, and in part 2, I will talk about the Albanian alphabets, because we had several, so it deserves its own video. Alphabets or scripts are interesting because they reveal a lot about the past history of a country. If you look at this map, you'll probably wonder why so many people use the Latin script today, and even if you're not Albanian, you should look into why your country does or doesn't do it today. Albanians use the Latin script now. It's not because our language derived from Latin. In fact, in the language tree, you'll see that Albanian, like Armenian, stands alone and didn't descend from any living language. The most commonly held theories by scholars is actually that it evolved from Illyrian, but they also wonder whether it could have evolved from Thracian or another ancient Paleo-Balkanic language. The undeniable fact, however, is that it is native to the Balkans, because Albanian is an isolated language, as you can see on this. It hasn't been spoken anywhere else in the world, and because it sits on its own, it is not similar to Latin, Slavic, Greek, or anything else either. This basically means that no language will make it easier for you to learn Albanian, I'm sorry. For example, it was easy for me to learn Danish and English because I already spoke German, and those three are in the same branch. But now that I'm learning Spanish, it's not as easy for me, unfortunately. But let's get back to the alphabets. In modern times, we had to decide which one worked best for our language and whether we should borrow from the ones we already knew or invent our own. So just between 1750 and 1850, we used at least 10 different alphabets. Some were borrowed, most were invented. You can find them here actually in Robert Elsie's book or just online. Oh, you can. So I'm going to talk about the borrowed ones and why we borrowed them. In the past, literacy was often limited to religious authorities, such as priests, as well as the upper class. And in 1820, only 12% of the whole world's population could read and write. However, when literacy became more and more common, Albanians had already been split into at least 3 different worlds by various occupiers. This means that Albanians from northern Albania, influenced by the Catholic Church, used Latin letters. Those from southern Albania, influenced by the Greek Orthodox Church, used Greek letters. And of course, the Albanian Muslims used the Arabic script because they were influenced by the Ottomans. But what is amazing is that we still wrote in Albanian by borrowing the ones we learned and adapting them to our language. The oldest Albanian texts that we know of, written by our OGs, have all been in the Latin script, such as the oldest book, the Meshore by John Bozuku from 1555. Here's the text. Another popular one is the baptismal formula, written by Palingeri from 1462. This is the short text for that. Fun fact, he was close with Gjergj Kastrioti and Togajini, but that's another story. The first non-religious book was the first Albanian dictionary, written by Frank Borde in 1635. It's called the Latin Epirot Dictionary, and it looks like this. There's many others who used Latin script at this time too, but as I said, we also used other alphabets. Here's an example of Albanian in Greek script from 1580 and one in Arabic script from the early 20th century. They're all in Albanian, just with different alphabets. There's other alphabets we borrowed, but these 3 were the most common. Latin was the most popular one and was favored by the Albanian community in Italy, who has historically fought for our independence from the Ottomans and the preservation of our ancient language and culture. In fact, this was the common goal of all the Albanian communities everywhere. A lot of our writing came from, for example, Egypt and America and aimed to promote the unity of all Albanians. They were free to do so because in Albania, writing in Albanian was seen as nationalistic by the Ottoman authorities, and nationalism was illegal for a long, long time. That's also why the first official and legal Albanian school didn't open until 1887, and yes, the Ottomans did try to shut that down too. Until then, the Albanian language was taught privately in unofficial schools, so that's why I say it was the first official school, not the first school overall. That's also why our books and newspapers, etc., were all published outside of our country. Ultimately, all these efforts in promoting our language and culture and many other efforts during the Ririndja movement led to our independence. I hope you learned something. Now hop on over to part 2, where I'll get into the really interesting stuff, the Albanian alphabets.